Silas Boone came to Drybone Valley with a contract in his pocket and guilt in his soul. He was hired to break Clara Hayes to find the flaw that would steal her farm from under her feet. But the moment he sees her planting seeds with torn hands, refusing pity and refusing defeat, something inside him begins to change. In a land where water is scarce and trust is even scarcer, can a man with a dark past become the one person a wounded widow dares to believe in? Please like, comment your thoughts, share the story, and subscribe to follow more heartfelt journeys across the West.
The dirt in Drybone Valley didn't just feel dead, it felt mean. It felt like it held a grudge against anything that tried to live. The sun had even crested the eastern ridge yet. The sky was just a bruised purple, but the heat was already there, waiting, heavy. Clara Hayes knelt in the middle of her 80 acres. She stared down at the earth. It was baked solid, cracked into jagged little puzzle pieces. She reached into the canvas pouch tied to her waist. Her fingers brushed against the remaining seeds. She didn't need to look to know the number. 47, that was all she had left. 47 kernels of corn to feed a ghost of a farm. Clara brought her hands down. No gloves. They were a luxury she'd had sold 2 towns ago. She dug her fingers into the crust. The dry clay bit back. It tore at her cuticles. Blood, dark and thick, beaded up under her nails. She didn't wince. She didn't have the energy to waste on the pain. She just pressed her bleeding fingers into the dirt, hollowed out a small pocket, and dropped a single seed inside. 1, she whispered. She covered it up, patted the dust down, moved her knees a few inches forward. Dug again. 2. A shadow fell over the furrow. Clara stopped. She looked up, squinting against the early morning glare. It was Abby, 9 years old, with her mother, stubborn chin, and a faded flour-sack dress that was getting too short at the ankles. She was holding a tin dipper. "Water's getting low, Mama," Abby said. Her voice was quiet, too quiet for a kid. Clara wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, careful not to smear the blood on her face. She took the dipper. The water tasted like copper and dust. It was the best thing she'd ever had. "We'll draw more tonight, Sweet Pea," Clara said. "The spring's just taking its time." It was a lie. The spring wasn't taking its time. The spring was gone. 3 years of drought had choked the life out of Drybone. But a mother does what a mother has to do. She lies to keep the fear out of her little girl's eyes. Clara handed the dipper back. She pushed herself up to her feet. Her back popped, her joint with a deep, hollow kind of tired. She needed the plow. She walked toward the barn. It was barely standing. The roof slumped on one side like a tired old hound. Leaning against the weathered siding was her plow, or what was left of it. The left wooden handle had splintered entirely the day before, snapped clean off when she hit a buried rock. She stared at it. For a second, just 1 second, she wanted to cry. She wanted to scream at the empty sky. But then she saw the white paper. It was nailed right above the barn door, crisp, clean, out of place. Clara pulled it down. She didn't read fast, but the bold black letters at the top didn't take much figuring out. Texas and Pacific Railway. Notice of eviction. Dispute of title. They wanted her land. Cornelius Vance and his men in their tailored suits. They wanted the dirt she was currently bleeding into. 60 days to prove her claim, or pack her bags. Clara folded the paper, slowly, carefully. She slipped it into her pocket. She walked back to the field, ignoring the broken plow. She dropped back to her knees. She dug her bare hands into the earth again. Harder this time.
The rock scratched her palm. She didn't care.
3, the day dragged on. The sun climbed high, turning the sky into a blinding sheet of white. Clara kept digging, knees bruised, hands torn, breathing in nothing but dust. By the time the sun started to dip, casting long, stretching shadows across the valley, Clara was running on nothing but pure, unadulterated spite. That was when the stranger rode in. Clara didn't hear him at first. His horse stepped light, a big dark roan. The man on its back sat tall loose in the saddle, like he belonged there, more than he belonged on his own 2 feet. He pulled back on the reins. The horse stopped right at the edge of her property line. Clara stopped digging. She sat back on her heels. She didn't reach for the shotgun by her bucket. She just stared at him. The man swung down from the saddle. He was tall, lean, but broad-shouldered. He wore a dusty Stetson pulled low, but the dying sun caught the jagged edge of a gunpowder burn scarring the left side of his neck. Silas Boone. He did tip his hat. He didn't offer a charming, lopsided smile. He looked at her hands. He saw the blood. He looked at the 40 feet of earth she had dug up with nothing but her own flesh and bone. Then he turned his head and looked at the barn. At the broken plow, leaning against the wood, Silas walked over to the barn. His boots crunched heavy in the dirt. He picked up the broken plow. Clara stood up, her muscles screaming in protest. "Drop it," Clara said. Her voice was raw from the dust. "That's my property." Silas didn't drop it. He reached into his boot and pulled out a heavy Bowie knife. He walked over to a stack of scrap wood near the fence, picked a sturdy piece of hickory, and sat down on a barrel. He started to whittle, long, smooth strokes. The wood shaved away. Clara marched over to him. I said, "Drop it. I don't need a stranger riding onto my land, thinking he needs to fix my life." Silas didn't look up. He just kept carving. The shape of a handle was already forming in his hands. "I ain't fixing your life, ma'am," Silas said. His voice was low, like gravel tumbling over velvet. "Just fixing a piece of wood. I don't need your charity, and I don't need rescuing." Silas stopped carving. He blew the sawdust off the hickory wood. He looked up at her. His eyes were dark, steady, and dead serious. "I know you don't," Silas said. He stood up. He was a full head, taller than her, but he didn't crowd her space. He held the newly carved handle up. "I've seen plenty of men ride the frontier, snatching the reins or the tools right out of a woman's hands. They do it because they think it makes them look like men. They call it chivalry." Silas shook his head. He walked over to her broken plow and began fitting the new handle into the iron socket. "It ain't chivalry," Silas stated plainly, driving the wood into place. "A woman's labor is her own property. It is equal to any man's out here. When a man takes your work from your hands without asking, he isn't saving you. He is stealing your dignity. He is telling you that you ain't capable." He tested the weight of the plow. It held firm. "I respect a person's right to work their own land," Silas continued, turning to face her directly. "You have the right to bleed for this dirt just as much as anyone else. I ain't here to do your work for you. I am just making sure your tool works, so you can finish the rows you started on your own terms." He stepped back. He gestured to the repaired plow. Clara looked at the plow, then she looked at the man. For the last 2 years, every man in Drybone had either offered her pity or tried to buy her out. Nobody had offered her an equal footing. Nobody had told her she had the right to her own sweat. She walked over to the plow. She gripped the handles. The new hickory was smooth against her torn palms. It felt solid. "I don't have money to pay you," Clara said. She looked out at the darkening field. "I didn't ask for a wage," Silas replied. He walked over to his horse and untied his bedroll. "Name's Silas. Clara." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She pushed the plow forward. The iron blade bit into the dead earth. It cracked open. Silas watched her walk down the row. He didn't follow. He just stood there as the sun finally sank below the ridge, leaving Clara Hayes to do exactly what she was meant to do: survive. Drybone was a town running out of breath. You could hear it in the wind. The wind didn't whistle here, it wheezed. It scraped against the wooden siding of the buildings. It carried grit that settled in your teeth and stung your eyes. Silas Boone walked his roan down the main stretch. The street was empty. The saloon doors hung still. A single dog lay under the boardwalk panting, too tired to bark. Silas had stopped in front of a two-story building. The paint was sign. Above the door read Martha S. Rest. He tied his horse to the hitching post. He loosened the saddle girth. He patted the animal's dusty neck. Then he pushed through the batwing doors. The inside smelled of stale coffee and old lye soap. Clean, but tired. A woman stood behind the counter. Martha Higgins. She was 50-something, built like a cast-iron stove, and had eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She wiped down the wood with a rag. She didn't smile. "Kitchen is closed," Martha said. "I need a room," Silas replied. He pulled off his hat. Dust cascaded from the brim. Martha looked him up and down. She saw the scar on his neck. She saw the way his gun belt sat on his hip. Worn, familiar. "Not a decoration. $2 a week," Martha said. "In advance, no drinking in the rooms, no women you ain't married to." Silas reached into his vest. He set $2 silver on the counter. The metal clinked. Loud in the quiet room, Martha slid the coins toward her. "You looking for work, stranger? Because there ain't any, unless you're digging graves." "I have work," Silas said. Martha narrowed her eyes. Doing what?" "Watching the dirt." Silas took his key. He turned and walked up the creaking stairs. Martha watched his back until he disappeared. She didn't trust him. Men with quiet voices and heavy boots usually brought trouble, and Drybone had enough of that. The next afternoon, Silas was back at the Hayes farm. He didn't bring his horse. He walked the 2 miles from town. He didn't knock on Clara's door. He didn't ask for water. He just stood at the edge of her fields. Clara was out there, pushing the plow he had fixed. Her shoulders were hunched. Her pace was slow, but it was steady. She saw him. She didn't wave. She just kept walking behind the blade. Silas knelt down. He picked up a handful of earth. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. It powdered, like ash. He stood up. He looked at the horizon. He watched the way the dust devils whipped across the plains. He felt the wind on his face. He was mapping the air. He was reading the ground. When the sun finally dropped, the heat broke. The desert night crept in, bringing a sharp chill. Silas walked up to the farmhouse. He sat down on the edge of the wooden porch. He pulled a small, leather-bound book from his pocket and a stub of a pencil. He started making notes. The screen door creaked. Abby stepped out. She held a patched quilt around her shoulders. She stood a few feet away, watching him. Kids always know when it's safe to approach a stranger. Silas didn't chase her off. He didn't talk down to her. He just kept writing. "What are you doing?" Abby asked. Her voice was a small, high chime in the dark. "Figuring," Silas said. "Figuring what?" Silas closed the book. He looked at the little girl. He patted the wooden floorboards next to him. Abby hesitated, then patted over. She sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. Silas reached into his coat. He pulled out 3 smooth river stones. He lined them up on the porch. Clara stood just inside the door, hidden in the shadows of the kitchen. She held a damp rag in her hands. She froze. She listened. "Your mama is working hard, Abby," Silas said. "But hard work on dead dirt just breaks your back. You need an edge." "We need a miracle," Abby whispered. "Mama prays for one every night." Silas shook his head, slow and firm. "Miracles don't pull water from dry clay, Abby. Science does," Silas said. His voice was clear. He wanted her to understand every word. He tapped the first stone. "I want you to listen to me carefully. People think farming is just putting a seed in the dirt and hoping it rains. That is wrong. When the land turns hostile, hope is not enough. You need to understand the mechanics of the earth. Abby tilted her head. Mechanics? Yes, like a machine, Silas explained. He picked up the rock and placed it in her small palm. Feel that? It's cold. Tomorrow morning, before the sun comes up, I want you to go out to the field. I want you to take stones just like this one and place them right at the base of the little green shoots your mama planted. Why? Because of temperature and evaporation, Silas said, explicitly, emphasizing the words. During the day, the sun bakes the soil. It sucks every drop of moisture into the air. But at night, the air cools down. This rock will get cold. In the early morning, the moisture in the air will hit this cold rock. It will turn into condensation, dew. The rock catches the water out of thin air. It drips down into the soil, right at the root. And during the day, the rock acts like a shield. It blocks the sun from baking that tiny patch of dirt. Abby stared at the rock in her hand. Her eyes went wide. It catches the water? Yes, Silas said. It is a physical law. It doesn't rely on luck. It doesn't rely on the sky being kind. It relies on knowledge. You use the temperature of the stone to trick the air into giving you water. You use the shadow of the stone to keep it. That is agricultural science, Abby. When you understand how the world works, you don't have to wait for someone to save you. You save yourself. Inside the house, Clara leaned against the wall. The damp rag in her hands went still. She had spent 2 years feeling completely helpless. She had spent 2 years feeling like the sky was punishing her. No one had ever told her she could fight back with anything other than blind endurance. No one had ever spoken to her daughter about science or self-reliance or the sheer mechanical truth of survival. Silas stood up. He tipped his hat to Abby. Collect the stones tomorrow, Abby. Build the shields, Silas said. He turned and walked away. He dissolved into the darkness of the trail back to town. Clara pushed the screen door open. She walked out onto the porch. Abby looked up at her mother. She held the 3 smooth stones tight against her chest. Did you hear him, Mama? Abby asked. I heard him, Clara said. She looked out at the dark road. Her chest felt tight, but for the first time in 36 months, the tightness wasn't fear. It was something else. It felt heavy. It felt real. It felt like a seed taking root. The next morning, Clara was in the field before dawn. She didn't start planting right away. She walked the perimeter of her property. She gathered stones, big ones, small ones, flat ones. She filled her apron until the canvas groaned under the weight. Abby was out there with her, kneeling in the dirt, placing the stones exactly where Silas had instructed, creating tiny fortresses around the invisible seeds. The sun began to crest. The sky bled orange and gold. Silas arrived just as the heat started to press down. He didn't say good morning. He walked straight past Clara and went to the barn. He came out carrying a heavy iron wrench and the plow. Clara stopped her work. She wiped her hands on her skirt. She walked over to him. Silas had the plow tipped on its side. He was fitting the wrench onto the main bolt that held the iron blade in place. The muscles in his forearms flexed tight as he pulled. The rusted bolt groaned, then gave way. What are you doing? Clara asked. I just got that fixed. The handle is fixed. The blade is wrong, Silas said. He adjusted the iron collar. He slid the blade down. 2 full inches deeper. He tightened the bolt back up. He stood up and looked at her. You're scratching the surface, Clara, Silas said. That's how my husband planted. That's how everyone in Drybone plants, Clara argued. You go too deep, the seed suffocates. Silas shook his head. He didn't argue with anger. He argued with facts. Your husband farmed in wet years. This is a dry decade, Silas stated verbally, his voice steady and authoritative. I want you to listen to the science of what you are doing. When you plant shallow, you are training the roots to be lazy. They spread out horizontally, just beneath the surface, waiting for the rain to come down to them. But the rain isn't coming. He pointed to the ground. Underneath this baked crust, deep down, there is residual moisture. It's trapped deep in the subsoil. If you want these plants to survive, you must practice deep plowing. We have to force the roots to go down. When you set the blade deep, you break the hardpan. You create a loose channel of dirt going straight down. The roots will follow a path of least resistance. They will dive deep into the earth, seeking the water table. Clara looked at the plow, then at him. You're talking about dry farming, she said. She had heard the term whispered by desperate men in the feed store before they went bankrupt. I am talking about adapting to reality, Silas said. If you coddle the plant with shallow dirt, the first week of August sun will kill it. You must teach the crop to survive adversity by forcing it deeper into the ground. It is the only way to establish a permanent hold. Clara stared at the adjusted blade. It made sense. It terrified her to change what Nathaniel had taught her, but Nathaniel was dead, and the old ways were dead too. Show me, Clara said. Silas moved behind the plow. He gripped the hickory handles. Take the harness. You guide, I'll push. They worked. They didn't talk about the heat. They didn't talk about their pasts. They spoke in the language of labor. Pull left. Hold steady. Deep here. The plow bit into the earth. It screamed against the clay, but it cut deep. A rich, dark trench opened up behind under them. Clara felt the vibration of the iron through the leather straps. She felt the power of the man pushing behind her. It wasn't a domineering power. It was an anchoring power. They were equal partners against the dirt. Back in town, Martha Higgins was doing the weekly sweep. She walked down the narrow upstairs hallway of the inn. She carried a broom and a dustpan. She unlocked room number 4, Silas's room. It was neat, too neat. The bed was made with military precision. The single window was cracked open to let out the heat. A heavy leather saddlebag sat on the rickety wooden chair by the wash basin. Martha started sweeping. She moved around the chair. The broom handle caught the edge of the saddlebag. The bag tipped. It hit the floor with a heavy, dull thud. The brass buckle, old and worn, popped open. Martha cursed under her breath. She knelt down to pick it up. As she lifted the flap to push the spilling contents back inside, the sunlight from the window caught a flash of metal. Martha stopped. She reached into the dark leather. Her fingers brushed again till silver. She pulled it out. It was a badge, an unblinking silver eye stamped in the center. Above it, the words were etched deep. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Martha, S. breath hitched. Pinkertons. They were the hired muscle for the rich. They broke strikes. They ruined lives. They were ghosts who wore suits and carried badges. She looked back at the bag. Sticking out from a side pocket was a folded piece of thick parchment paper. Martha's hands were shaking slightly. She pulled the paper out. She unfolded it. It was a contract. The legal language was thick, but Martha was a smart woman. She read the clauses. She read the target. Margaret Calloway. Wait, Clara Hayes. Target, Clara Hayes. Property, Lot 14, Drybone Valley. The objective was clear. Investigate land deed validity. Discover or manufacture grounds for immediate seizure and transfer of title. At the bottom of the page, the ink was dark and bold. Signed, Cornelius Vance, President, Texas and Pacific Railway. Martha dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floorboards. She looked at the Pinkerton badge in her hand. The silver felt like ice. Silas Boone wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a farmhand. He was a corporate spy. He was a weapon pointed directly at Clara's heart. Martha clenched her jaw. She shoved the contract back into the bag. She threw the badge in after it. She buckled the straps tight. She stood up, grabbed her broom, and walked out of the room. She locked the door behind her. She marched downstairs to the parlor. She sat in her rocking chair. She waited. It was past dark when Silas finally returned. He walked through the batwing doors. His boots were caked in fresh, dark mud from deep below the surface. His shirt was plastered to his back with sweat. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had fought a war and finally found some peace. He walked toward the stairs. "Boom," Martha called out from the dark corner of the parlor. Silas stopped. He turned slowly. He couldn't see her face in the shadows, but he could hear the venom in her voice. Martha stood up. She walked into the dim lamplight. "I knocked your bag over today," Martha said. She didn't blink. She didn't sugarcoat it. Silas went perfectly still. His posture didn't change, but the air around him grew instantly cold. His hand drifted just an inch toward the heavy iron on his hip, a reflex. "I saw the silver," Martha continued, her voice rising, thick with disgust. "I saw Vance's signature. I saw her name on your paper." Silas pulled his hand away from his gun. He let his arm drop to his side. He didn't deny it. He didn't make excuses. "How much are they paying you?" Martha hissed. "How much does a widow's land cost these days? How much to break a woman who's out there bleeding into the dirt to feed her child?" Silas looked down at his own hands. The dirt was under his fingernails. His palms were blistered from Clara's plow. $500, Silas said softly. Martha scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. $500. And you go out there, you play the savior. You fix her plow, you talk to her little girl, you get her to trust you. That makes you worse than a thief, Boone. A thief just takes your money. You're taking her hope. Silas looked up at Martha. His eyes were hollow, haunted. He remembered the way Clara looked at him today. Not with suspicion, not with fear, but as an equal. He remembered the feel of the deep earth yielding to their combined strength. He was hired to find a crack in her armor, to exploit a flaw in her paperwork so Vance could steal her home. That was the job. That was what he was paid for. But Silas was beginning to realize something terrible. He had spent his whole life doing the dirty work for powerful men. He had enforced laws written by thieves. He had evicted families in the name of progress. He had told himself it was just a job. But out there in the field, with the smell of turned earth in his lungs, he didn't feel like a detective. He felt like a man. "I haven't sent a report to Vance," Silas said. His voice was rough. "Then pack your bags and leave," Martha ordered, pointing to the door. "Before she finds out what you really are. If you have a shred of decency left in your black soul, you will ride out of Drybone tonight." Silas stood in the quiet parlor. The clock on the wall ticked, a loud, rhythmic sound. He had a choice. He could take his horse, ride out, and let Vance send someone else, someone crueler, or he could stay. He could look Clara Hayes in the eye. He could tell her the truth and watch the hard-won respect turn to absolute hatred. Silas Boone slowly reached up. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "I'm not leaving, Martha," Silas said. He turned and walked up the creaking stairs, carrying the weight of 1,000 sins and the memory of 47 planted seeds. Drybone woke up slow. It didn't greet the morning. It just surrendered to it. Silas Boone walked down the boardwalk. His boots hit the warped pine planks. A steady, hollow thud. He hadn't slept. He'd sat in his dark room all night, listening to the wind rattle the window glass. Martha Say's words still echoing in his head. You're taking her hope. He had a job to do. But the job was changing shape. It was turning into something ugly. Something he couldn't stomach anymore. He needed to look at the town records. He needed to see the paperwork on Nathaniel Hayes's death. The Pinkerton Agency had taught him that the easiest way to break a widow's claim was to find a flaw in the inheritance. To prove the husband didn't own it free and clear when he died. Or worse, he stopped in front of a narrow building at the end of the street. The sign in the window was painted in fading gold letters. Dr. Josiah Clark, Medicine and Surgery. Silas pushed the door open. A little bell chimed, weak and sad. The office smelled like iodine and stale whiskey and fear. Dr. Clark was sitting behind a heavy oak desk. He was a small man, thinning hair, spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He looked up when Silas walked in. His hands immediately dropped below the desk, like a man caught stealing. Office hours don't start till 8, Clark said. His voice shook. Just a little. Silas closed the door behind him. He turned the deadbolt. A loud, metallic snap. Clark swallowed hard. Are you sick, mister? No, Silas said. He walked over to the desk. He didn't sit down. He just loomed over the smaller man. I'm looking for a cure, though, for a bad record. I don't know what you mean.
Silas reached into his coat.
He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a small leather notebook. He flipped it open. 2 years ago, Silas said, his voice flat, Nathaniel Hayes fell off a barn roof, broke his neck. You signed the coroner's report. You ruled it a tragic accident. Clark's face went the color of old chalk. That's public record. Anybody can read it. It was a tragedy. The man slipped. I saw the barn, Doc, Silas said. He leaned forward. He planted both hands flat on the desk. It's barely 10 feet off the ground at the eaves. There's soft dirt underneath. A man falls from that height. He breaks a leg, maybe a collarbone. He doesn't shatter his cervical spine, not unless a horse steps on him after he lands. Clark looked away. He stared at a jar of tongue depressors. Sometimes the human body is fragile. A bad angle, bad luck. You're lying, Silas said softly. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The quietness was worse. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the silver Pinkerton badge. He tossed it onto the desk. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of the doctor. Clark stared at the unblinking silver eye. He started to tremble. I'm a man who finds things out, Silas said. Cornelius Vance hired me to find a crack in Clara Hayes's deed. I came here looking for a legal loophole, but I think I just found a murder. Clark covered his face with his hands. A dry, ragged sob tore out of his throat. He reached into his bottom desk drawer. He pulled out a bottle of rye and a dirty glass. He didn't pour a drink. He just gripped the bottle like a lifeline. They came in the night, Clark whispered. Vance's men. 3 of them. They brought Nathaniel in a wagon. He was already dead. The back of his skull was caved in, crushed, like somebody hit him with a heavy iron pipe. Silas didn't move. And they told you to write it up as a fall. They didn't just tell me. Clark snapped, suddenly angry. He looked up. His eyes were wet and wild. They put a gun to my wife's head, Boone. They stood right in my parlor. They told me to sign the paper, or they would make her a widow too. Silas felt a cold knot pull tight in his stomach. Clark stood up from his chair. He was shaking, but he wasn't hiding anymore. The dam had broken. I am a doctor, Clark said. His voice was loud now, desperate. He was practically shouting. I spent my life studying the human body to save it. But you listen to me, Boone. You need to understand what this town has become. The Hippocratic Oath demands that I protect life. First, do no harm. That is the bedrock of medical ethics. I convinced myself that by signing a fake report, I was protecting my wife's life. I told myself I was choosing the living over the dead. Clark slammed his fist on the desk. But I was wrong, the doctor cried out. The words spilled from him like a confession to a priest. Medical ethics aren't just about breathing. They are about truth. The integrity of the body, even in death, is sacred. When a doctor lies about how a man died, he robs the family of justice. My silence killed my humanity. I thought saving my wife's physical life was the only moral choice. But stripping away the truth from a widow is crueler than stripping away her property. I poisoned Clara Hayes's life because I was a coward. Clark fell back into his chair. He buried his face in his hands again, weeping. Silas stood perfectly still. The doctor's words hit him like a physical blow. Stripping away the truth is crueler than stripping away property. Silas looked down at the silver badge on the desk. He had spent 10 years wearing it. 10 years telling himself that as long as he followed the contract, his hands were clean. But a contract written by a devil was just a recipe for hell. Silas reached out. He picked up the badge. He slid it back into his pocket. Then he reached into his coat. He pulled out the thick parchment paper. The contract signed by Cornelius Vance. The paper that promised him $500 to ruin a woman who planted corn with bleeding fingers. In the corner of the office, a small cast iron stove was burning to fight off the morning chill. Silas walked over to it. He opened the iron door. The heat washed over his face. He didn't hesitate. He tossed the contract inside. The flames caught the edge of the paper. It curled. It turned black. The thick wax seal melted into nothing. Within 5 seconds, the only proof of his employment with the Texas and Pacific Railway was a pile of gray ash. Silas closed the stove door. The metal clanged shut. Final. He turned back to the doctor. Write a new report, Doc, Silas said. Clark looked up. Vance will kill me. Vance isn't here, Silas said. His voice was like cold steel. I am. You owe Nathaniel Hayes the truth. Write the report, sign it, date it for today, and keep it locked up until I tell you. Silas didn't wait for an answer. He unlocked the door. He walked out of the office and into the blinding Texas sun. He wasn't a Pinkerton anymore. He was just a man, and a man had a lot of making up to do. The farm was quiet when Silas walked up the dirt road. Too quiet. The wind had died down. The air was thick, stagnant. Silas felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He stopped at the edge of the property line. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. He looked at the house. Something was hanging from the front door. Silas drew his Colt. A smooth, practiced motion. The heavy revolver felt natural in his hand. He kept his thumb on the hammer. He walked fast, silent. When he reached the porch, his jaw tightened. Nailed to the center of the wooden door was a large, black crow. It was dead. Its wings were splayed out, pinned with heavy iron spikes. A warning. The front door opened. Silas raised his gun, stepping to the side. Clara stood in the doorway. She held a basket of laundry. She stopped. She looked at Silas. Then she looked at the dead bird nailed to her door. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the basket. Her face just turned stone. Vance's men? Silas said quietly. He lowered the gun. Clara set the basket down. She walked over to a toolbox sitting on the porch. She pulled out the claw hammer. She stepped up to the door and wedged the claw under the first iron spike. She pulled. The nail groaned and popped out. The bird's wing fell limp. They came in the night, Silas said. A coward's trick, trying to scare you. It takes more than a dead bird to scare me, Clara said. She pulled the second nail. The crow dropped to the porch floor. She picked it up by the legs and tossed it into the weeds. I'll bury it later. Silas watched her. She was tough, tougher than the dirt she plowed. But toughness didn't stop bullets. He checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds, fully loaded. He clicked it back into place. "Walk with me," Silas said. Clara looked at him. She saw the serious set of his jaw. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him. He led her out behind the barn, away from the house, away from Abby. He found an old rusted tin can lying in the dust. He picked it up. He walked 20 paces away and set it on a fence post. He walked back to Clara. He held out the revolver. "But first, take it," Silas said. Clara looked at the gun. She didn't move her hands. "No." "Clara," Silas said. His voice was hard, urgent. "They nailed a bird to your door today. Tomorrow they'll shoot your dog. The day after that, they'll burn your barn. You are a woman living alone with a child. You need to know how to protect yourself. I am protecting myself. Out there in the dirt." "Corn won't stop a hired gun," Silas said. He grabbed her right hand. He placed the heavy Colt in her palm. He folded her fingers around the grip. "It's a single-action army. You have to pull the hammer back before you pull the trigger. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to destroy whatever is in front of you." Clara felt the cold steel. It was heavy. It felt like death. She raised the gun. She aimed it at the tin can. Her arm trembled. "Breathe out," Silas instructed, stepping close behind her. "Sight down the barrel. Squeeze. Don't jerk." Clara stood there. The wind picked up, swirling dust around her boots. She stared down the iron sights. She could see the tin can. But in her mind, she saw a man's chest. She saw blood. She saw the endless cycle of violence that had swallowed the whole damn West. She lowered the gun. "I won't do it," Clara said. "You have to," Silas pushed. "If Vance's men ride onto your property tonight, what are you going to do?" Clara turned around. She shoved the revolver back into Silas's chest. He had to catch it to keep it from hitting the dirt. Her eyes were blazing. Green fire. "I am going to stand my ground as a citizen," Clara. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp in the empty yard. "You listen to me, Silas. You think a gun is the only kind of armor out here. But you are wrong. I want you to understand exactly what I am doing." She pointed a finger at his chest. "I have the right to defend my homestead under the Married Women's Property Act of Texas," Clara stated explicitly, pronouncing every syllable. "That law was written to ensure that a widow cannot be stripped of her property without due process. It is a legal shield. If I take this gun and I shoot one of Vance's men, I give them exactly what they want. I cross the line from a lawful property owner defending her rights to a murderer. I become an outlaw." Silas stared at her. He held the gun down by his side. Clara didn't stop. She was fiercely educating him on her reality. "Vance owns the sheriff."
"He owns the judge,"
Clara explained, her voice vibrating with intensity. "If I pull that trigger, they won't put me on trial for defending my land. They will hang me for murder, and the railroad will take my farm legally the very next day. Violence is a trap set for the poor. The moment I use violence, I forfeit the protection of the law. I will beat Cornelius Vance by remaining a lawful citizen. I'll beat them with seeds, not bullets. I will hold this land legally until they run out of breath." Silas listened, really listened. He had spent his whole life solving problems with a drawn gun, but he saw the absolute terrifying logic in her words. She was fighting a war of attrition, a legal and moral war. A gun would lose her the farm in 5 seconds. He slowly holstered the Colt. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara Hayes," Silas said quietly. "I'm a mother," Clara corrected him. "And mothers don't have the luxury of acting like cowboys." The anger left her shoulders. She sagged a little. The adrenaline was fading. She looked down at her hands. Silas looked at them too. Her hands were a ruin. The knuckles were split. The cuticles were crusted with dried blood. The skin was scraped raw from the dry farming, from digging deep into the hard pan to save the crop. Silas didn't say anything. He reached into his saddlebag, slung over the nearby fence. He pulled out a small tin of carbolic salve and a roll of clean white cotton bandages. He walked back to her. "Give me your hands," Silas said. His voice wasn't hard anymore. It was gentle. Clara hesitated. She was used to fighting alone. She was used to hiding the pain. Slowly, she held her hands out. Silas took them. His hands were large, calloused, scarred, but his touch was incredibly light. He opened the tin. He scooped out a small amount of the sharp-smelling salve. He rubbed it gently into the cracked skin of her palms. Clara flinched. It stung. "Steady," Silas murmured. He took the cotton roll. He began to wrap her right hand over the knuckles, around the palm. He didn't wrap it too tight. He made sure her fingers could still bend. He needed her to be able to hold the plow tomorrow. He tied off the cotton string. He started on the left hand. They stood there in the dust behind the barn. The sun was beating down. The dead crow was lying in the weeds. The threat of the railroad hung heavy in the air. But right there, in that one square yard of dirt, there was peace. Silas finished tying the second bandage. He didn't let go of her hand right away. He looked down at the white cotton covering the bruises. "You're right about the gun," Silas said softly. "But you can't fight them totally alone, Clara. The law is a shield, but a shield gets heavy." Clara looked up at him. She met his dark eyes. "I know," Clara whispered. Silas let go of her hands. He took a step back. "I'll be sleeping in the barn tonight," Silas said, "just in case the law needs a little backup." He turned and walked toward the barn. Clara stood in the yard, looking at her freshly bandaged hands. They felt warm. They felt protected. She turned and walked back to the house. She had a farm to run. The creek bed was a graveyard. It snaked through the valley, pale and hollow. The mud had turned to gray chalk a long time ago. Its banks were lined with the skeletal remains of willow brush, brittle and white like old bones in the sun. Silas rode his roan straight up the middle of the dead channel. He had left the farm before sunrise. He didn't tell Clara where he was going. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to understand how a valley that was naturally shaped to catch the spring thaw had turned into a dust bowl. Drought was one thing. The sky withholding rain was an act of God. But the earth usually held a memory of water, a dampness under the stones, a lingering green in the deepest shadows of the river bend. Here, there was nothing. It was unnatural. It was too thorough. He rode north for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the back of his neck. The creek bed began to narrow as it cut into the rocky foothills. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in Drybone. Not anymore. It was a low, steady rush, a heavy, liquid hum. Silas spurred his horse. They climbed out of the dry wash and up a steep embankment. He crested the ridge and looked down into the next gorge. He pulled back on the reins. He just sat there. The anger started in his chest, hot and sharp. It wasn't a drought, it was a murder. Stretching across the narrow neck of the canyon was a wall, solid timber and thick, poured concrete. A man-made dam, nearly 40 feet high. Behind it, a massive reservoir of dark blue water rippled in the morning breeze. It was millions of gallons, hoarded, trapped. The water was supposed to flow south. It was supposed to feed the creek that ran right past Clara Hayes' front door. Silas urged his horse closer. He rode down to the edge of the structure. Nailed to a heavy pine post was a sign, crisp white paint, black letters, private property, Texas and Pacific Railway. Vance Cornelius. Van hadn't just bought up the dry land. He had made it dry in the first place. He choked the valley off at the neck, starving out the homesteaders, waiting for them to break. And when they broke, swept in and bought the deeds for pennies. It was brilliant, and it was evil. Silas turned his horse around. He rode hard. He pushed the roan to a heavy gallop all the way back to the farm. When he rode into the yard, the sun was sitting high at noon. Clara was out in the field. She was hauling a bucket of the river stones Abby had gathered, placing them around the base of the tiny green shoots that had miraculously started to push through the dirt. She saw him ride in hard. She dropped the bucket and walked toward the barn. Silas swung down from the saddle. His horse was lathered in white sweat. He didn't bother tying the reins. "What is it?" Clara asked. She saw his dark, furious. "It's as not God, Clara," Silas said. His chest heaved. "It's as Vance," he told her. He told her about the concrete, the timber, the lake of blue water sitting just 10 miles north, locked behind a railroad gate. Clara stood dead still. The wind blew a lock of dusty brown hair across her face. She didn't brush it away. She just stared at him. 2 years. 2 years of watching her crops wither. 2 years of praying to a silent sky. 2 years of thinking she was cursed, that she failed her husband as legacy. And the whole time, the water was just sitting behind a wall of corporate greed. "They choked us out," Clara whispered. Her voice was thin, brittle. "Yes," Silas said, "my husband. He died trying to hold on to a farm that Vance was actively starving." "Yes." Clara looked down at her hands. The white bandages Silas had wrapped around them were already stained brown with dirt. She clenched them into fists. "I'm going to town," Clara said. Her voice changed. It went cold. "I'm going to tear his head off." "No, you aren't." Silas stepped in front of her. "Get out of my way, Silas." "Listen to me," Silas said. He grabbed her by the shoulders. Not hard, but enough to stop her. "You go to town right now. You play right into their hands. They own the sheriff. They own the judge. You cause a riot, they lock you up, and they take this farm by sunset. You don't beat a man like Vance with a temper. You beat him with the earth." Clara looked up at him. The fury in her eyes was blinding. "There is no earth left, Silas." "He took the water." "He took the surface water," Silas said loudly. He let go of her shoulders and pointed down at the dirt between their boots. "He stole the creek, but he can't steal geology." Clara frowned. The anger faltered, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about?" Silas turned and pointed across her 80 acres. He pointed toward a slight depression in the land near the southern fence line. A lone, twisted mesquite tree grew there. It was stunted, ugly, but it was green. "I want you to look at that tree, Clara, and I want you to listen to what the land is telling you," Silas instructed explicitly. He walked a few paces toward it, gesturing for her to follow. "Vance blocked the creek 3 years ago. So how is that mesquite tree still alive? How are your deep-plowed seeds finding enough moisture to sprout?" "The dew," Clara said. "The stones catching the dew." "That helps the top layer," Silas corrected her. "But a tree that size needs gallons. It's getting them from underneath. I studied land surveys for the Pinkertons. I know how to read the ground. I want you to understand the science of an aquifer." Clara folded her arms, listening intently. "Water doesn't just vanish when it sinks into the dirt," Silas explained, his voice taking on a steady educational rhythm. "It filters down through the porous topsoil. It travels through gravel and sand. But eventually, deep down, it hits a layer of impermeable rock, solid bedrock, or heavy clay. The water can't sink any further, so it pools there. It creates an underground reservoir, a water table. It flows beneath our feet like a slow, hidden river." He walked over to the spot near the mesquite tree. He stomped his boot on the dry crust. Vance dammed the surface. He stopped the creek, Silas continued, laying out the facts clearly. But he cannot dam the underground flow. The aquifer stretches for miles under this whole valley. That tree is surviving because its taproot is 40 feet long, plunging straight down into that hidden water. The water is there, Clara. It is right under our boots. We just have to dig for it. Clara looked at the dirt. She looked at the twisted, stubborn tree. "A well," she said softly. "A deep one," Silas nodded. "But we don't have a drilling rig. We just have shovels, pickaxes, and our own backs. It'll be pure, brutal labor." Clara didn't hesitate. "I'll fetch the shovels." They started an hour before sundown. Silas picked the exact spot. He chose the lowest point in the depression, right near the deep-reaching roots of the mesquite. They cleared the brush. They mapped out a circle, 5 feet across, and they dug. The first 2 feet were easy. Loose, dusty topsoil. Then they hit the hard pan, baked clay, thick as iron. Silas swung the heavy pickaxe, over and over. The heavy thud of steel hitting clay echoed in the quiet valley. He fractured the earth. Clara followed right behind him with the shovel, scooping the broken clods, tossing them over her shoulder. They fell into a rhythm, a violent, silent dance. Swing, crack, scoop, throw. The sun dropped. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, then pitch black. The desert cold seeped in. Abby came holding a kerosene lantern. She set it on the edge of the hole. The yellow light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls of the pit. "You should go to bed, Sweet Pea," Clara said, pausing to wipe the sweat from her eyes. "I want to watch," Abby said, pulling her blanket tight around her shoulders. Clara looked at Silas. He was covered in gray dust. His shirt was soaked through, but he didn't stop swinging. "Let her stay," Silas grunted between swings. "She needs to see how you win." By midnight, they were 6 feet down. The hole was tight. The air was close and smelled of old, ancient dust. Silas's hands were raw. The friction of the hickory handle was chewing through his causes. Clara's bandages were torn and filthy. Her shoulders burned with a fire she had never felt before. Every time she lifted a shovelful of dirt, her lower back screamed. "Take a break," Silas said. He leaned on the pickaxe, his chest heaving. "No," Clara said. She drove the shovel into the dirt. "If we stop, my muscles will lock up. I won't be able to start again." Silas looked at her, really looked at her. Standing waist deep in a hole in the ground, face streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes glowing with pure, unyielding defiance. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "All right," Silas said softly. "We keep digging. 3 in the morning. 10 feet down." Silas had to build a makeshift ladder out of rope and scrap wood just to haul the dirt out. He would fill a canvas bucket. Clara, standing at the top, would haul it up by a rope, dump it, and lower it back down. The dirt began to change color. It went from pale gray to a deep, rich brown. Silas swung the pickaxe. The sound was different. It wasn't a sharp crack. It was a dull, heavy thwack. The steel sank deep. It didn't bounce off. Stop. Silas pulled the pickaxe loose. He dropped it. He dropped to his knees. "Silas?" Clara called from the top. Her voice was tight with worry. "What is it? Did you hit rock?" Silas didn't answer. He took off his heavy leather glove. He reached down into the broken earth. He dug his bare fingers into the soil. It was cold. He squeezed his fist. The dirt didn't crumble into dust. It clumped together. It held its shape. "Lower the lantern," Silas said. His voice was hoarse, trembling. Clara grabbed the wire handle of the lantern. She lowered it down the hole on a piece of twine. The yellow light hit the bottom of the pit. The bottom wasn't dusty. It was gleaming. Water. It wasn't a rushing river. It was a seep, slow, steady. The dark, muddy water was bubbling up through the fractured clay, pooling around Silas's boots. Silas looked up at the circle of the sky above him. He saw Clara's face looking down, framed by the stars. Mud, Silas said. A massive, tired smile broke across his face. We hit mud. Clara gasped, a sharp, ragged sound. She dropped the rope. She practically scrambled down the crude rope ladder, slipping on the damp walls, not caring if she fell. She hit the bottom. Her boots splashed in 2 inches of muddy water. She fell to her knees right next to him. She didn't care about her dress. She didn't care about the cold. She plunged her hands into the pooling water. She scooped it up. It was thick, gritty, brown. She brought it to her face. She splashed it over her cheeks. She pressed her wet, muddy hands over her eyes. She started to laugh. It sounded like a sob at first, but it morphed into a wild, breathless laugh. Silas knelt beside her. The water was rising, slowly but steadily. It was coming up from the deep rock. The aquifer was real. The science had worked. Clara turned to him. Her face was masked in wet mud. Her green eyes were bright with tears. "It's here," Clara whispered, looking at her hands. "It was here the whole time." "It's yours," Silas said. "Vance can't touch this. This belongs to the deep earth." Clara didn't say a word. She just reached out. She grabbed the collar of Silas's muddy shirt and pulled him in. She pressed her forehead against his. They stayed like that. Kneeling in the rising mud, 10 feet below the surface of the dry Texas desert, they were exhausted, battered, and absolutely filthy. They were breathing hard, sharing the same tight, damp air. There was no romance in the dirt. There were no violins playing. There was only the smell of wet clay, the ache of torn muscle, and the profound, unbreakable bond of two people who had clawed life out of the ground with their bare hands. Silas closed his eyes. He felt the cold mud seeping through his jeans. He felt the warmth of Clara's skin against his. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that he would kill any man who tried to take this from her. Above them, peering over the edge of the dark hole, Abby's small face appeared. "Mama?" the little girl called down. "Did we find the miracle?" Clara pulled back. She looked up at her daughter. She looked at Silas. She smiled, wiping a streak of mud from her chin. "No, Abby," Clara called back, her voice ringing clear and strong up the shaft. "We found the science." Morning came slow. The sky turned from black to a bruised purple, and finally to a pale, dusty blue. The desert didn't wake up with birdsong. It woke up with heat. Down in the pit, the water had settled. It was about 2 feet deep. It was muddy. It was thick. And it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. She sat on the edge of the hole. Her legs hung over the side. Her dress was ruined. Her boots were caked in heavy, wet clay. She held a tin cup in her lap. She just stared at the dark reflection at the bottom of the well. Silas was by the water trough. He was washing his face. The water he'd hauled up by bucket was gritty, but it was cold. He splashed it over his neck. It had washed away in the dust of a long, brutal night. He walked over to Clara. He sat down next to her. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. The hole in the ground said it all. "We need to line the walls," Silas said softly. "Use fieldstone. Keep the clay from collapsing in on itself." Clara nodded. "We have stones." Abby gathered plenty. "It's a good start," Silas said. Then the wind shifted. It carried a sound that didn't belong in Drybone Valley. Not on a quiet Tuesday morning. It wasn't the slow, heavy creak of a farm wagon. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic trot of a lone rider. It was a sharp, fast rattle, the jingling of expensive silver harnesses, the heavy thud of 4 matched horses running in perfect time. Silas stood up. His hand dropped naturally to his hip. resting on the worn leather of his holster. Clara stood up, too. Her muscles screamed, stiff from the digging. She looked down the long dirt road that led to the highway. A carriage was coming. It was black, polished so bright it reflected the harsh Texas sun like a mirror. It rolled on suspension springs that absorbed the deep ruts of the road. Two men rode up front. One drove the team. The other sat beside him, holding a double-barreled shotgun, resting easy across his knees. The carriage pulled into the yard. It stopped right between the house and the barn. The dust settled around the polished wooden spoke wheels. The driver wrapped the reins. He didn't move. The man with the shotgun didn't move. The heavyside door of the carriage opened. A man stepped out. He didn't wear a dusty Stetson. He wore a crisp, gray bowler hat. He didn't wear denim. He wore a tailored charcoal suit. A gold watch chain hung across his vest. His shoes were black leather, shined to a high gloss. He stepped onto the dry earth. He looked down at his shoes, watching the dust settle on the leather. He frowned. Just a little. Cornelius Vance, president of the Texas and Pacific Railway. He looked around the farm. He saw the broken fence. He saw the slumped roof of the barn. He saw the twisted mesquite tree. Then, eyes landed on Clara. He smiled. It was a polite smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," Vance said. His voice was smooth, cultured, like a man offering you a drink just before he poisons it. Clara stepped forward. She didn't wipe the mud from her face. She stood tall. "You're trespassing, Mr. Vance," Clara said. Vance chuckled, a dry, quiet sound. He reached into the carriage and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He held it in his right hand. "I'm merely paying a neighborly visit, Mrs. Hayes," Vance said. He walked toward her. He stopped 10 feet away. He didn't look at Silas. He acted like Silas wasn't even there. "I understand the land office sent you a notice. Your deed is in dispute. I also understand that the drought has been exceedingly cruel to this valley." "The sky didn't choke this valley," Clara said. "You did. You dammed the creek." Vance didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He just kept smiling. "Progress requires water, Mrs. Hayes. The trains need steam. The towns need reservoirs. We are building the future of Texas. Sometimes the past has to dry up to make room for it." He tossed the heavy leather pouch. It hit the dirt right at Clara's feet. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. "Gold. $800, Vance said, plus $200 for travel expenses. That is $1,000 in minted gold. Enough to take your daughter to Dallas, to buy a nice house with a porch, to put her in a proper school. Signed the deed over to the railroad today, and you never have to bleed into this dirt again." Clara looked down at the bag. For a second, the yard was dead silent. $1,000. It was more money than Nathaniel had made in 5 years. It was an absolute fortune. "Pick it up, Mrs. Hayes," Vance urged, his voice dropping to a comforting hum. "There is no shame in knowing when a fight is over. You fought well. Now, take the grace I am offering you." Clara didn't look at the gold. She looked at Vance. "My husband didn't fall off the barn," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Vance's smile finally slipped, just a fraction of an inch. Silas stepped out from the shadow of the barn. He walked up to stand right beside Clara. Vance looked at him. The railroad man's eyes narrowed. "Boone," Vance said. The warmth was completely gone from his voice. "I sent you here to do a job. I see you've decided to play farmhand instead. The Pinkertons will hear about this." "I'm not a Pinkerton anymore," Silas said. Silas reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It wasn't the Pinkerton contract. He'd burned that. It was the paper Dr. Clark had written the day before." Silas unfolded it. He held it up so Vance could see the seal. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Vance. Silas said. He spoke slowly. He made sure every word was a hammer striking an anvil. This is a signed affidavit from Dr. Josiah Clark, Silas stated verbally, ensuring the educational weight of the moment was absolutely clear. It details the exact nature of Nathaniel Hayes's injuries. It describes the blunt force trauma to the back of his skull. But more importantly, it details the coercion. Dr. Clark has sworn on the record that 3 of your men held a gun to his wife's head to force him to forge the original coroner's report. Vance stared at the paper. He didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. You think a piece of paper matters out here? Vance sneered. I know the law matters, Silas countered. His voice rose, carrying the weight of a lecture. Let me explain the law to you, Vance. A forced coroner's report is not just a mistake. It is a felony under state law. It constitutes criminal fraud, violent coercion, and accessory to murder after the fact. When you orchestrated that forgery, you didn't just break a man's neck. You broke the legal foundation of this county. If this paper goes to the state capitol, your corporation can be seized, and you can hang. Vance laughed, a short, barking laugh. You are a fool, Boone, Vance said. He adjusted his coat. You think the law is written in books? The law is written in bank ledgers. I have bought the sheriff in this town. I have bought the circuit judge. I dine with the governor in Austin. You bring that paper to a courtroom, and the judge will declare the doctor a drunk and a liar. You have nothing, because out here, capital is the only law that matters. Vance turned back to Clara. The offer stands for exactly 1 minute, Mrs. Hayes. Pick up the gold, or I will let the bank foreclose on the disputed title next week, and you will leave here with nothing but the clothes on your back. Clara didn't reach for the gold. She stepped over the leather bag. She stepped right into Vance's space. She was a foot shorter than him. She was covered in mud, but she looked at the railroad president like he was a bug on the bottom of her boot. You are a very wealthy man, Mr. Vance, Clara said. Her voice didn't shake, but you are deeply uneducated about what makes a human being. Vance blinked, taken aback by her tone. You think you can put a price tag on everything, Clara continued. She spoke explicitly, her words ringing out like a bell in the quiet yard. But I want you to hear this, and I want you to remember it. Human rights do not have a price tag stamped by the Texas and Pacific Railway. She pointed, a dirt-stained finger directly at his chest. The right to life, the right to own property, the right to basic dignity. These are not privileges that you hand out when it suits your business model, Clara stated, her voice full of fierce, educational clarity. These rights belong to every citizen by birth. The law was not created to be a weapon for the rich to bludgeon the poor. It was created to ensure that a widow and her child have the exact same standing in a courtroom as a millionaire with a private train. Vance glared at her. His jaw tightened. Words, Vance spat. Empty words from a desperate woman. They are not empty, Clara fired back. You think wealth makes you immune to basic human decency. You think because you can buy a judge, you can buy the truth. But a real man is measured by what he grows, Vance, not by the dirt he steals from a widow. You can buy the sheriff. You can buy the town. But you cannot buy my humanity, and you cannot buy my land. She kicked the heavy leather pouch. It slid across the dirt. It hit the toe of Vance's polished leather shoe. Take your blood money, Clara said, and get off my property. Vance looked down at the gold. Then he looked up at Clara. The polite mask was completely gone. His face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. He had never been spoken to like that. Not by a man, and certainly not by a woman. He slowly bent down. He picked up the pouch of gold. He didn't brush the dust off it. He just gripped it tight in his fist. He looked at Silas. You chose wrong, Boone, Vance said softly. You know how I handle obstacles. I don't go around them. I crush them. I'll be waiting, Silas said. His hand rested easy on his Colt. Vance turned. He walked back to its polished carriage. He climbed inside. The heavy doors slammed shut. The driver cracked the whip. The 4 horses surged forward. The carriage ripped out of the yard, kicking up a massive cloud of yellow dust, heading back toward town. Clara stood in the yard. She watched the dust settle. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she didn't fall apart. She took a deep breath. The air smelled like dry sage and wet mud. Silas walked up beside her. That was a brave speech, Silas said. It wasn't a speech, Clara said. It was the truth. He won't let it go, Clara. He can't. If he lets one homesteader stand up to him, it sets a precedent. He will bring the whole weight of the company down on this farm. I know, Clara said. She turned and looked toward the well they had dug. But we have water now. We can hold out. Silas looked out at the road. His eyes were dark. He knew men like Vance. He knew they didn't fight fair. He's going to use the town, Silas said. He's going to turn Drybone against you. He'll make it so you can't buy seed. He'll make it so you can't buy flour. He will try to starve you out by cutting off your neighbors. Clara looked at her bandaged hands. Then she looked back at Silas. Then we fight him in there too, Clara said. She turned and walked back toward the pit. She picked up a heavy field stone. She carried it over to the edge of the well. She dropped it in. It hit the muddy bottom with a satisfying splash. Come on, Clara said, looking back at him. We have a well to build before the sun goes down. Silas smiled, a real, genuine smile. He walked over, picked up a stone, and stood beside her. The devil had come in a suit. He had offered them the world, and they had sent him packing. The war was officially on. But for the first time in 2 years, Clara Hayes wasn't fighting it alone, and she wasn't fighting it on dry land. The wind didn't howl, it choked. It started as a yellow bruise on the western horizon. By noon, it swallowed the sun. The dust rolled into Drybone Valley like a solid wall. It crept under the doors. It sifted through the window frames. It coated the floorboards in a fine, gritty powder. Clara tied a damp rag over Abby N's nose and mouth. She sat the girl near the cold iron stove. Keep your eyes closed, sweet pea, Clara said. Her own voice sounded muffled, scraped raw by the dirt in the air. She walked to the window. She couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see the fence. The world ended 3 feet past the glass. Vance hadn't just brought the dust. He had brought a sickness to the town. Clara had felt it the day before. She had driven the wagon into Drybone to buy flour and coffee. The street had been quiet. Too quiet. People she had known for 10 years turned their backs when she walked past. The blacksmith suddenly found something fascinating to look at on the ground. When she walked into the general store, the owner didn't greet her. He just pushed a piece of paper across the counter. It was a handbill, printed on cheap paper. Warning to citizens. Silas Boone is a registered agent of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, known for violence, known for deceit, currently taking shelter with the widow Clara Hayes. Decent folks should guard their families and their morals. Clara had stared at the paper. She hadn't bought the flour. She hadn't bought the coffee. She had walked out of the store, feeling the heavy, judging eyes of the entire town burning into her back. Now, standing in the dark farmhouse, listening to the wind tear at the roof, she felt the true weight of it. The back door rattled. It pushed open. Silas stepped inside. He had to force the door shut against the wind. He was covered in yellow dirt. He pulled a bandana down from his face. He coughed a deep, rattling sound. "The horses are secured," Silas said. "I patched the hole in the barn roof. It should hold." Clara didn't say thank you. She just walked over to the kitchen table. She picked up the crumpled handbill she had brought back from town. She held it out. Silas looked at it. He didn't take it. He knew what it said. "They plastered them all over town yesterday," Silas said. "Nailed them to the church doors. Pinned them to the saloon." "They are calling me a whore, Silas," Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "They are saying I am trading my bed for a hired gun. The women in this town won't look at my daughter anymore. Abby S. teacher crossed the street to avoid us." Silas closed his eyes. The dust stung them, but the guilt stung worse. "It's Vance," Silas said. "He knows he can't beat you on the land right now, not since we hit the water. So he is attacking you where you are completely unprotected." Clara gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles went white. "I can fight the dry dirt," Clara said. "I can fight a broken plow. But how do I fight a whole town? How do I look my daughter in the eye when the world is calling her mother trash?" Silas walked over to the table. He didn't reach out to touch her. He stood there, holding his dustahi hat in his hands. "You want to know how men like Vance wage war?" Silas asked. His voice was hard, clear. He was making sure she heard every single word. "I will tell you exactly how it works. Isolation is a deliberate weapon, Clara. It is a calculated strategy. When a powerful man cannot break your legal right to your property, he will attempt to break your social standing in the community." Clara looked up at him. She was listening. "I need you to understand the mechanics of what he is doing to you," Silas stated explicitly, leaning forward slightly. "Reputation is a form of currency for a woman in this society. Vance knows that. He is spreading lies to bankrupt your reputation. If he can turn the town against you, he isolates you from your support system. He makes sure no one will sell you seeds. No one will offer you a line of credit at the bank. He creates a social prison around your farm." He pointed to the handbill on the tape bead. "They don't care about morals," Silas explained, his tone firm and educational. "They care about leverage. If they convince the town you are a fallen woman, then the town will not object when the railroad illegally forecloses on your home. Social ruin is just the first step toward financial ruin. It is a cowardly tactic, but it is incredibly effective." Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at the bedroom door, where Abby was sitting on the floor. Her heart broke. Not for herself, for her little girl. "You have to leave," Clara said. The words hung in the dusty air, heavy. Final. Silas didn't flinch. "If I leave, you are entirely alone. Vance's men will come back. And next time, it won't be a dead crow. If you stay, my daughter's name is ruined forever." Clara shot back. "I can survive losing this farm, Silas. We can move. We can start over in another territory. But if Abby carries the stain of this town's gossip for the rest of her life, her future is dead. No respectable school will take her. No decent family will associate with her. I will not sacrifice my daughter's life to win a dirt farm." Silas stared at her. He saw the absolute terrifying resolve of a mother. She was right. The town didn't care about the truth. They cared about the scandal. And his presence here was the match Vance used to light the fire. True love wasn't about standing your... It hurt someone else. It was about knowing when to step back. It was about respecting her right to make the hard choice. "All right," Silas said softly. He didn't argue. He didn't try to play the hero. He turned around. He pulled his bandana back up over his nose. He pulled his hat down low. "Where will you go?" Clara asked. Her voice cracked just a little. "Out," Silas said. He opened the back door. The yellow storm ripped into the kitchen. throwing dirt across the floor. Silas stepped out into the howling wind. He pulled the door shut behind him. Clara stood in the kitchen. She listened to the sound of his boots on the porch. Fading away, she walked over to the window. She put her hand flat against the cold glass. She couldn't see him. She couldn't see anything. She was completely, utterly alone. She slid down the wall. She sat on the dusty floorboards. She pulled her knees to her chest, and for the first time in 2 years, Clara Hayes buried her face in her hands and wept. Out in the storm, Silas didn't ride toward town. He saddled his roan. He tied a thick blanket around the horse's neck to protect its lungs from the dust. He checked his saddlebags. He checked his gun. He wasn't running away. Vance thought he had won. Vance thought he had successfully isolated the widow. But Silas Boone knew how the system worked. He knew that a corrupt town judge was useless if you brought in a bigger hammer. Silas pointed his horse east, into the teeth of the storm. It was 150 miles to the state capital in Austin. It was a suicide ride in a dust storm, but he had a piece of paper in his pocket signed by Dr. Clark, and he knew an honest lawyer in the city who owed him a life debt. Silas spurred the horse. They vanished into the yellow dark. The morning of the trial was perfectly clear. The dust storm had blown itself out over the weekend. It left the sky a brilliant, washed-out blue. The air was still. The heat was already rising off the dirt roads. Clara stepped out onto her front porch. She wore her best dress. It was a faded navy blue, patched at the elbows. She had washed Abby's face and braided her hair tight. They were going to court. They were going to lose everything, but they were going to do it with their heads held high. Before heading to the wagon, Clara walked out to the field. She needed to see it one last time. She walked out to the rows she had plowed with Silas. She walked out to the deep furrows where she had buried her 47 seeds. She stopped. She looked down. She dropped to her knees in the dirt. Green, vivid, bright, impossible green. Tiny shoots, no taller than a man's thumb, had broken through the heavy crust of the earth. They were standing straight up, defiant, alive. Clara reached out. Her hand hovered over the fragile leaves. She didn't touch them. She was afraid they were a mirage, but they weren't. The deep plowing had worked. The stones had caught the dew. The deep water from the well had nourished the roots. The land wasn't dead. She had brought it back to life with her bare hands. With Silas's science, a tear slipped down her cheek. It landed in the dry dirt beside the green shoot. "Mama?" Abby called from the porch. "It's time." Clara stood up. She wiped her face. She looked at her field of tiny green miracles. "Let's go," Clara said. The courthouse in Drybone was just a large room above the saloon. It smelled of stale beer, sweat, and cheap cigars. The room was packed. Every chair was taken. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The whole town had come to watch the widow fall. Clara walked down the center aisle. She held Abby's hand. She kept her chin up. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She ignored the whispers. She ignored the sneers. She took her seat at the defendant's table. It was empty. She had no lawyer. At the plaintiff's table sat Cornelius Vance. He wore a fresh suit. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man about to eat a very satisfying meal. Next to him sat a team of 3 expensive lawyers from Dallas. The judge banged his gavel. Judge Higgins, an old man with a red nose and a pocketbook lined with railroad money. "Court is in session," the judge barked. "Matter of the Texas and Pacific Railway versus the estate of Nathaniel Hayes. Dispute of land title. Does the defendant have counsel?" Clara stood up. "I represent myself, Your Honor." Vance smiled. A cruel, thin line. "Very well," the judge said. "Mr. Vance?" Present your case. Vance lead lawyer stood up. He was smooth. He talked for 20 minutes. He talked about unpaid taxes. He talked about a discrepancy in the original land grant from 1865. He threw around heavy legal terms designed to confuse the room. He painted a picture of a poor, confused widow holding on to land that rightfully belonged to the state and, by extension, the railroad. In conclusion, the lawyer said, adjusting his spectacles, the title is invalid. The railroad has properly compensated the state for the tract. We ask for immediate eviction. The judge nodded along. Seems straightforward. Mrs. Hayes, do you have any evidence to contradict these filings? Clara stood up. Her hands were shaking. She placed them flat on the table to steady herself. She was about to speak. She was about to tell them about the dam, about the murder. But she knew they wouldn't listen. She was a woman. She was alone. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. They hit the walls with a loud, cracking bang. The room went dead silent. Everyone turned around. Silas Boone walked down the aisle. He looked like hell. His clothes were caked in white dust. His face was unshaven. There were dark circles under his eyes. He had ridden 300 miles in 4 days, but he wasn't alone. Walking right beside him was a man in a sharp black suit. He carried a heavy leather briefcase. He had gray hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of posture that commanded absolute attention. Excuse the interruption, Your Honor, the man in the suit said. His voice was deep, authoritative. It cut through the stale air of the courtroom like a razor. My name is James Whitmore, senior counsel from the State Attorney General's office in Austin. I am here to represent Mrs. Clara Hayes. Vance stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floor. Objection. This is a local municipal matter. State Council has no jurisdiction here. I have jurisdiction when there is evidence of a capital felony, Mr. Vance. Whitmore shot back. Whitmore walked to Clara's table. He looked at her. He gave her a small, respectful nod. He opened his briefcase. Silas stood behind Clara's chair. He looked down at her. He gave her a weary, beautiful smile. He had kept his promise. Whitmore pulled out a stack of papers. Your Honor, Whitmore said loudly, ensuring the entire room heard him. The railroad is attempting to claim this land through a fraudulent title dispute, but that is the least of their crimes. I have in my hand a sworn, notarized affidavit from Dr. Josiah Clark, the town medical examiner. The crowd murmured, heads craned to see. In this document, Whitmore continued, Dr. Clark confesses to forging the coroner's report regarding Nathaniel Hayes. He states explicitly that Mr. Hayes was murdered. His skull was crushed, and Dr. Clark was forced to rule it an accident at gunpoint by men employed by Cornelius Vance. The courtroom erupted. Men shouted. The judge hammered his gavel, his face turning purple. Order! Order in this court, the judge yelled. He pointed a shaking finger at Whitmore. This is hearsay. Dr. Clark is not here to testify. I will not allow wild accusations in my courtroom. It is not hearsay. A voice boomed from the side of the room. Everyone froze. Sheriff Tobias Miller stepped forward from his post by the wall. He was a man who had spent 10 years looking the other way. He had taken Vance's bribes. He had let the railroad run roughshod over the town. He had grown fat and comfortable on his own cowardice. But looking at Clara Hayes, a woman who had dug a well with her bare hands, a woman who had stood up to Vance alone, something inside, the old sheriff finally broke. Miller walked to the center of the floor. He took off his silver star. He held it in his hand. The doctor isn't here because I helped him pack his bags last night, Sheriff Miller said. His voice was remarkably steady. I sent him on a stagecoach to Austin, so Vance's men couldn't kill him before the state marshals hear his testimony. The affidavit is real. I know it's real because I was standing outside the Dr. S house the night Vance's men threatened his wife. I saw it. I did nothing. Vance's face went completely white. Miller, you are a dead man. Maybe, Miller said. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at the jury box. He looked at the men of Drybone. I need every man in this room to listen to me, Sheriff Miller said. He spoke slowly. He spoke with the absolute clarity of a man delivering a vital lesson. We have forgotten what the law is for, Miller stated explicitly, raising his voice so it echoed off the wooden beams. I forgot it. The judge forgot it. The law was not invented to be a weapon for rich men to steal from the poor. The law was born to be a shield for the weak. It is the only thing standing between civilization and the law of the jungle. He pointed to the badge in his hand. I want you all to understand the principle of equality before the law. Miller continued, ensuring the educational message was completely verbalized. It means that a widow in a patched dress has the exact same power in this room as a millionaire from Dallas. It means that money cannot buy the truth. When we let a corporation dictate who lives and who dies, who keeps their home and who is thrown into the dirt, we don't have a town anymore. We have a prison. And I am done being the warden of Cornelius Vance's prison. Miller walked over to the judge's bench. He slammed the silver star down on the wood. I resign as sheriff of Drybone, Miller said. He turned to Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, I am placing myself under your custody. I will testify in Austin to every bribe I took and every crime I helped this railroad cover up. The courtroom was dead silent, a heavy, stunned silence. The townspeople looked at Miller. Then they looked at Clara Hayes, the woman they had shunned, the woman they had called names. She sat there, her head held high, holding her daughter's hand. Vance's lawyers were frantically whispering to each other. They were packing their briefcases. They knew when a fire had breached the firebreak. James Whitmore looked up at the judge. Your Honor, Whitmore said, his voice dripping with authority. In light of this confession, I demand an immediate dismissal of the title dispute. Furthermore, I have a warrant here from the state governor authorizing the immediate arrest of Cornelius Vance for conspiracy to commit murder and an injunction to destroy the illegal dam on the North Creek. The judge looked at Vance. Vance looked away. The power dynamic in the room had completely shattered. Judge swallowed hard. He hit his gavel. It sounded weak. Case dismissed, the judge mumbled. Title remains with Mrs. Hayes. The courtroom didn't cheer. They just exhaled, a collective breath of shock and relief. Vance stood up. He adjusted his coat. He tried to maintain his dignity, but his hands were shaking. Two state deputies, who had been waiting in the hall with Whitmore, walked in and took him by the arms. They led the railroad king out the back door. Clara sat at the table. She closed her eyes. It was over. Silas placed his hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, real. Clara looked up at him. You came back. I told you, Silas said, his voice rough from the road. I don't walk away from a good piece of land. Abby tugged on Silas's dusty coat. Did you bring the rain, Silas? Silas smiled down at the little girl. He looked at Clara. No, Abby, Silas said. Your mama did all the heavy lifting. I just helped pull the weeds. Drybone didn't throw a parade. There was no brass band. Folks just woke up the next morning, drank their coffee, and went back to work. But the air was different. It felt lighter. The heavy, choking fear was gone. Cornelius Vance was sitting in a jail cell in Austin. Sheriff Miller was testifying before a state judge. Texas and Pacific Railway had pulled its men out of the valley entirely. Martha Higgins walked out of her inn. She carried a heavy iron crowbar. She walked straight up to the telegraph pole in the center of town. She scraped off the handbill calling Clara a whore. She tore the cheap paper to shreds. She let the wind take the pieces. Then Martha walked over to the general store. She did the exact same thing to the poster on the door. The store owner watched her through the glass. He didn't stop her. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at his boots. The town was ashamed, and shame is a very quiet thing. The state engineers rode north on a Thursday. They brought a wagon heavily loaded with crates of dynamite. You could hear the crack all the way in town. A low, rolling boom. It shook the dust off the roofs. It now rattled the shot glasses in the empty saloon. 2 hours later, the water came back to Drybone. Clara stood on the bank of the dry creek bed. Abby stood next to her, holding her mother's hand tight. They listened. It started as a whisper in the dying cottonwood trees, a dry rustle. Then it became a hiss, then a steady roar. The water came around the bend. It wasn't clear, it wasn't pretty. It was dark brown, it was angry. It churned with 3 years of dead branches, tumbleweeds, and dry dirt. It carried the bones of the drought, but it was water. It rushed over the cracked earth. It filled the deep hollows. It soaked into the parched white banks. Abby let go of Clara's hand. She ran right to the edge. She didn't care about the mud ruining her shoes. She plunged her small hands into the rushing brown current. She splashed her face. She laughed, a loud, ringing sound that cut cleanly through the roar of the creek. Clara closed her eyes. She listened to the water moving over the rocks. The sound of it was a physical weight lifting off her shoulders. The creek was alive again. The land could finally breathe. Her 80 acres were safe. Before she went back to the house, Clara walked up the small hill to the edge of the property. She stood before a simple wooden cross, Nathaniel's grave. She looked down at the loose dirt. She didn't cry. She had cried all her tears out 2 years ago. The truth came out, Nathaniel, Clara said softly to the wind. The farm is safe. The deed is clear. Abby has a home. I kept my promise to you. But I am done fighting ghosts. I have to live for the living now. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, smooth river stone. One of the stones Silas had taught Abby to use to catch the dew. She set it gently on top of the wooden cross, a marker of survival. She turned her back to the grave. She walked down the hill. She didn't look back. The green shoots in the field were growing fast. They were strong. They had deep roots from the dry farming. Now, with the creek running and the deep well full, they were reaching fiercely for the sun. But the farmhouse felt too quiet. Silas hadn't come back. After the trial, he had tipped his hat to the judge. He had helped Mr. Whitmore load his heavy leather bags onto the stagecoach. Then, Silas had saddled his roan and ridden out of town. He didn't leave Texas. He set up a small camp near the edge of town, out by the old limestone ridge. He didn't ride up to Clara's porch. He didn't knock on her door. He was giving her space. He was letting her own her hard-won victory. He knew the town needed to see her standing on her own 2 feet, beholden to absolutely no man. Clara understood. She respected him deeply for it. But she was tired of fighting alone. She was tired of the empty chair at the kitchen table. She had spent 2 grueling years proving she didn't need anyone. She had won. Now, she had the luxury of deciding what she actually wanted. On Sunday morning, Clara saddled her horse. She rode out to the limestone ridge. The sun was hot, baking the smell of sagebrush into the air. Silas was sitting by a small campfire. He was boiling coffee in a blackened tin pot. He looked up when she rode in. He didn't stand right away. He just watched her dismount. He took off his hat and set it on his knee. "Coffee's about ready," Silas said. His voice was quiet, steady. "I didn't come for coffee," Clara replied. She tied her horse to a scrub oak. She walked up to the fire. She looked down at him. "You are a hard man to figure out, Silas Boone," she said. "You ride 300 miles in a blinding dust storm to save my farm. You bring the state attorney general to my defense. And then you sit out here in the dirt like a stray dog." Silas looked at the fire, the orange flames reflected in his dark eyes. "It is your farm, Clara. You won it," Silas said gently. "You stood up to Vance. You faced down the whole damn town. You didn't need me taking up space on your porch. I didn't want folks thinking I fought your battle for you. I didn't want to cast a shadow over what you built." Clara sat down on a flat rock across from him. "I want you to listen to me," Silas said firmly. Her voice was clear. It left no room for guessing. "People out here think a man and a woman only have two ways to be together," Clara stated explicitly, ensuring her words carried the full weight of a lesson. "They think either a man owns a woman like a piece of property, or he acts like a knight saving a helpless damsel. Both of those ideas are entirely wrong. A true relationship is an absolute, equal partnership." Silas looked up. He met her eyes. He was listening to every single syllable. "I am not a damsel," Clara continued, her tone steady and educational. "I don't need a savior. I proved I can protect my own land. I proved I can survive the worst this world has to offer. But surviving isn't the same as living. I want a partner. I want a man who stands beside me, not in front of me." She leaned forward. "I need someone who respects my independence, but shares the heavy labor of a life together," Clara said clearly. "Equality means we share the burdens, and we share the harvest. We make decisions together. Nobody owns anybody. You don't rescue me, and I don't serve you. We build together. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Silas absorbed her words. He didn't interrupt. He let the profound truth of it settle in the quiet desert air. "I understand," Silas said. He spoke just as clearly, matching her honesty. "For 10 years, I lived in a world where men used violence and power to control everything around them. I enforced that control. I am done with that. I don't want to control you, Clara. I don't want to save you. I just want to stand next to you. Mutual respect. Equal partners. Side by side." Clara looked at him. The last bit of tension finally left her weary shoulders. "Good," Clara said, "because my roof still has a leak, and the corn needs weeding." Silas smiled, a real, deep smile that reached all the way to his eyes. The jagged scar on his neck stretched. He looked younger. He looked entirely free. He stood up. He reached out his hand. Clara stood up and took it. Her hands were still rough. The bandages were gone, leaving pink, healing scars. His hands were thick with calluses. They fit together perfectly, not a grip of possession. A handshake of a promise. Then the sky cracked open. It wasn't dynamite this time. It was thunder, deep, rolling thunder that vibrated in the soles of their boots and rattled the tin coffee pot on the fire. Clara looked up. The sky had turned the color of bruised iron. A cool, heavy wind swept through the camp. It blew the smoke sideways. It smelled like ozone. It smelled like wet sage and distant earth. A single drop hit Clara's cheek. It was heavy, ice cold. Then another fell on Silas's shoulder, leaving a dark spot on his dusty shirt. Then the sky opened. It didn't drizzle. It didn't tease. It poured. It was the first real rain in 3 long years. It came down in heavy silver sheets. It hit the dry dirt, kicking up tiny puffs of dust before turning the ground dark and slick. It washed the white ash from the campfire, putting out the flames with a loud hiss. It washed the yellow dust from Silas's coat. It washed the grime and the exhaustion from Clara's face. They didn't run for the tent. They didn't seek cover under the trees. Silas pulled Clara close. She didn't resist. She rested her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating steady and strong beneath his wet shirt. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her wet hair. They stood there in the pouring rain. The water soaked through their clothes, to their skin. It felt like a baptism, a completely clean slate. Two broken people who had healed the land, and in doing so, had finally healed each other. The dead land was gone, the seeds were safe, and the cowboy had finally come home. This fictional story may include themes of romance, betrayal, violence, hardship, or emotional distress that could be sensitive for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised, as the purpose of these scenes is to create dramatic tension and emotional depth within the narrative world.
As Clara Hayes' story comes to an end, we are left with more than the dust of Drybone Valley, more than the image of a widow standing against a powerful railroad, and more than the memory of a stranger who chose redemption over greed. We are reminded that true strength is not always loud, and courage does not always ride in with a gun on its hip. Sometimes, courage is a mother kneeling in dead soil with bleeding hands, planting seeds when everyone else sees only failure. Sometimes, it is a child learning that hope is not magic, but something we build with knowledge, patience, and faith. And sometimes, it is a broken man choosing to turn away from the darkness of his past and stand beside what is right, even when doing so costs him everything. Clara's fight teaches us that dignity cannot be bought, stolen, or buried beneath lies. A home is not just land, wood, and fences. It is memory, sacrifice, love, and the place where a person's soul has taken root. Cornelius Vance believed that money could own the law, silence the truth, and dry up the hearts of good people. But he forgot one thing. The human spirit is deeper than any dam, stronger than any contract, and harder to kill than a seed waiting beneath the earth. This story reminds us that greed may build walls, but compassion finds a way through them. In the harsh world of the western frontier, where dust storms blind the eyes and powerful men prey upon the weak, kindness becomes an act of rebellion. Silas did not save Clara by taking her life into his hands. He helped her stand taller in her own. That is one of the deepest lessons here. Real love does not steal another person's dignity. Real love respects their labor, honors their pain, and walks beside them without trying to own their struggle. Clara's journey also speaks to every heart that has ever felt abandoned, judged, or pushed to the edge. It tells us that even when the world turns its back, even when hope seems buried, there may still be hidden water beneath our feet. We may have to dig for it, we may have to bleed for it, but life is often waiting deeper than fear allows us to see. And perhaps the greatest meaning of this tale is that justice begins when ordinary people refuse to surrender their humanity. A mother, a child, a repentant man, and a few honest neighbors can become stronger than a railroad empire when they stand on truth. So may this story stay with you as a reminder to protect what is good, to cherish those who stand beside you in hard times, and to never mistake gentleness for weakness. Because in the end, the West was not only shaped by gunslingers and outlaws, it was shaped by mothers, farmers, lovers, and wounded souls who chose mercy over cruelty, truth over fear, and hope over despair.